So, good afternoon and welcome to the second event of the Know the Gap Gender Lecture Series. My name is Nicolò Alessi and I'm a postdoc researcher at the World Trade Institute of the University of Bern. And as with the first lecture, I will be hosting this webinar today. As some of you may already know now, the Gender Lecture Series is organized by Professor Elisa Fornalé and her gender team in the framework of the SNF research project Gender Equality in the Mirror and the Horizon project HR Just. This year, we are exploring the fundamental concepts of gender studies, aiming at building an updated glossary of this field of study. And this is supposed to provide a timely contribution to research in this area by consolidating this field's foundational concepts. Today, we have the pleasure to have Professor Marie Mercat-Brun as our guest lecturer, who will give a lecture titled Gender Equality and Non-Discrimination at Work in the EU, a Model for Inclusion. And before giving her the floor, let me briefly introduce her. Professor Mercat-Brun is a prominent scholar in the area of gender equality and non-discrimination. She is full professor at the Sciences Po Law School and tenured associate law professor at the Conservatoire National des Arts et des Métiers. She also teaches several seminars at numerous French universities. In 2019, she was appointed as expert for France on gender equality for the EU Commission. And she recently published a book on gender equality and non-discrimination and inclusion that will be soon translated in English. So we are very, very honored to have her today as a guest lecturer, and I very much look forward to listening to her lecture. And before starting, I just wanted to remind everyone, as I also wrote in the chat, that the lesson is recorded and will be uploaded on the brand new website of the HR Just Intersect Observatory in the section Gender Lectures. As last time, after the presentation, we will open the floor for discussion. So absolutely feel free to raise your hand and share your comments and ask questions. We will be glad to give you the floor. So without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Mercat-Brun, and I thank her again for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Does everyone see it? Oh, wait, let me see.
Perfect.
Okay,
thank you.
Great. I'm going to make the little icon smaller. So I'm very, very honored to be invited by the World Trade Institute Bern on this series, Know the Gap Gender Lecture. I think it's really important for us to brainstorm on these issues. So just about me a little more. I'm Franco-American, so I'm going to be giving you a perspective which draws also from the French perspective outside of the European perspective. And you'll see this is not just about gender. This is about gender as a model to think of the paradigm of inclusion. So don't hesitate after for questions. So this is based on a book, and this book was started during COVID because a fellow friend of mine who was a lawyer working on class action litigation on gender equality thought that not pushed me, but encouraged me to write this book to try to think differently about how gender equality can be a form of prism, of critical prism on how we think of equality. Why? Because the sex discrimination is often about sameness and difference and can offer food for thought. Unfortunately, she passed away since then. And so this book is very important for me and I'm on a book tour, and this is inspired by the book. So if we come back to anti-discrimination law as just a foundation, I just want to recall for people who are not necessarily in law, because I have a legal perspective, this what's targeted on the European level is direct and indirect exclusions linked to a ground, linked to sex. But why did I put a tree? Because in general, the image of a tree is a good way to look at questions of discrimination. The trunk is basically the concepts of discrimination, direct discrimination, when one person is treated less favorably on the grounds of sex than another, has been, or would be treated in a comparable situation. That's the directives, 2006-54, the recast. And indirect discrimination, where an apparently neutral provision, criterion, or practice would put persons of one sex at a particular disadvantage compared with other persons of another sex. For example, when you work on part-time, and part-time affects disproportionately women in a firm. The other common trunk part of the tree is the shift of the burden of proof, which advantages the plaintiff who tries to prove the discrimination. The roots of all this is equality, of course, and to me, all the branches of the trees are all the grounds. So the idea is to eliminate categorizations when they're voluntary or involuntary. So what I was interested in was to see in what way the EU equality model was constructed on something structural, develop a structural view of equality. And this has been echoed in French sex and union discrimination case law. So I just want to mention that. It's very different from the American model, for example, who was more based on race discrimination with Title VII. And of course, extended to sex, but it's the racial model that was more promoted historically. So from the Treaty of Rome, we see it, equal pay is promoted, but also all the case law is from the beginning, without the EU saying it, based on systemic discrimination. Why can I say that? Because it's often based on collective bargaining. I'm going to be specifically on work, but you'll see my questions of inclusion are really can be applied to the educational sphere, to the health sphere, to other spheres outside of employment. So we see in a lot of the case law on the European level that there are structural ways of understanding the barriers to inclusion. So either part-time work, which is not paid well in the Jenkins case, or unequal work, unequal value for equal work, which is the Enderby case, or, for example, the way we evaluate work in pay grades in the Rumler case, the fact that you were doing physical work, you were paid more than other types of work, and that affected disproportionately women that didn't have physical work. But this can apply to social protections, like in the Brackner case, a reform of retirement that didn't include small pensions disproportionately affected women. You can also look at the career questions and the effect of maternity leave in the Nepali case, or the question of coming back from a parental leave and being fired because you're on part-time and your redundancy is based on your part-time work and in parental leave when you were full-time before. And the last case, which is a 2022 case, really interesting, how domestic work in Spain did not allow people to have an unemployment insurance when other types of work in the garden, etc., were covered by unemployment insurance. And this was very unfair because most of the domestic work at home was done by women. So all this shows you that basically what was constructed was a more structural and systemic view of discrimination. And I would describe it as, and it's not in the law, of course, formal and informal policies, practices, and decision-making processes that can result in barriers for and exclusion of persons protected by anti-discrimination law. So if I want to summarize, systemic discrimination is a combination of direct and indirect discrimination. For example, the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling, after a certain stage, you do not see women. Why? Because it's a combination of a lot of different discriminations that have accumulated. So we can come back on that. So we see this continuing with the diversification of the most recent directives on the European law level that affect gender. So the new directive of 2019 on work-life balance, which is really very structural because, of course, it's on taking into account personal life outside of work life to allow parental inclusion. The proposal for a directive on combating violence against women, which has a very more structural view of looking at how certain positions can make people more vulnerable to violence. The new directive on gender balance in listed companies, of course, that's a way to fight against the glass ceiling. Another directive to strengthen the application of equal pay and transparency, which uses indicators, and that's a more structural way of looking at equal work for work of equal value between men and women. And lastly, the new proposed directive on standards for equality bodies, which apply to women and men, but that also take into account more vulnerable groups, including female migrants. So we see that we have a hierarchy of norms that do come from the UN conventions. I'm going to come back to it. Of course, the treaties and the EU directive, and that have had a trickle down effect on French law. So I come back to this, but it's striking that gender mainstreaming has been used in a lot of French laws, and it doesn't only apply to strictly employment. For example, independent work is taken into account, where it's harder to protect against dismissal. We've had also in these laws the question of economic violence. For example, people who put their salary in an account which is not theirs. That shouldn't be something in employment law, legislation, but it is in France, and it takes into account the fact that we have to have a global view, a more structural view of equality. So why am I interested in inclusion? Because what's interesting is to see that beyond equality and anti-discrimination, it might be interesting to see how we can embrace the other grounds for discrimination in taking into account this more structural view of discrimination. And why is this? Because there are limits of litigation outside of class action. For example, we have more and more class action suits, and there is resistance to discrimination law. We also see a resistance to equality law. So it might be interesting to have a more positive perspective on the means to equality, and inclusion is a more positive work. The other advantage of thinking of inclusion, and we'll see it comes from the disability paradigm, is the idea that we have to have a bottom-up analysis through the narratives of people who are disadvantaged. And the idea of inclusion would be that people themselves in employment can co-construct the answers if they are, of course, surveyed in an anonymous way. So what I'd like to suggest to you is to see if today, in the other ways we look at inclusion, there are not always already concepts that we could be using to provide this process of inclusion. And why do I say that? Is because what strikes me is that instead of taking into account the groups that are excluded or disadvantaged, we could have a process which would not be status oriented, so not someone who has a certain job or is a certain group, but we could look at the means of emancipation and representation by taking away, eliminating the modes of resistance, the inaction to inclusion. And of course, we already have positive action on the European level, but you will see that positive action might have limits. So I'll come back to that. So the basic idea here is to promote inclusive environments through the potential of people to create social inclusion through targeting problems common to groups instead of only promoting the difference between groups and people. So why should we use other notions? I just want to remind you that we do have terms that seem to look at the same question as inclusion. For example, integration. We see it with immigration. But in the French perspective, integration is assimilation. So it's the idea that it's a process where a social group incorporates individuals to ensure its own cohesion. So integration of foreigners has never been really seen as the idea of taking into account uh, their perspective, but more how the interests of this majority, the collective interest, has to prevail over the minority group in terms of assimilation. And we see that in France because today, the way that integration has functioned was to regulate the right to work of immigrants in certain jobs only where we need them, and then the repression of undocumented workers or other workers that don't come into this perspective. And I would call it even not integration, but disintegration. We have another term that we could use is social inclusion. It's recognizing the multiple causes of exclusion. And that, from the crisis of the welfare state in France, there has been this idea of trying to target, well, who is excluded, and trying even to group all these excluded people, which is actually pretty stigmatizing. There was a very important book in France that created a turning point by Lenoir, which was called The Excluded, and included people with physical or mental disabilities, people that had lack of training, people who needed constant care, people who were a danger for others. And there you have this idea that you try to find the cause of exclusion, but you understand, of course, that this is a very negative way of seeing the groups. In the 80s was the idea with new poverty, the loss of income or limited income, that there was economic exclusion and social exclusion. And this more global way, in a human rights perspective, often create this idea of risk. And in France, we call insertion, this need to insert back people in society, seeing exclusion as a risk, but in a contractual way. We will integrate you, and that's workfare, if you make an effort to do some activities. But again, this is a negotiation, and this does not always take into account the potential of these people, just their potential to work. So where does inclusion come from? The inclusion model comes from a shift in the model of disability. And that's why you're going to see I go from sex to disability and then to all grounds. The idea would be that instead of, since the United States had, from the Rehabilitation Act of 1975, created a way to look at the question of disability and access to services for people with disabilities as going from a medical model of disability that comes from the cause of disability, like we looked at the cause of exclusion, to a more social model. And the idea was, and it's here, disability is part of the human experience, and in no way should limit the right for individual to ensure global inclusion in the mainstream, inclusion including the economic, it's not including the economic, political, social, and educational spheres of American society. So a very global perspective. In France, this was embraced in disability law with the need for reasonable accommodation. We have it all over Europe with the directive through 2078, this social model of inclusion, that if you want to include, you have to reasonably accommodate because, for example, a person in a wheelchair, if that person cannot access the workforce, even though they have the qualification, well, they can't work. So it's a more proactive view of the process. And so we see the different processes and how inclusion might be a new paradigm that we can use not only for gender, but also in a structural way for all grounds. So integration, we're going from the individual to society. You see how that's an injunction. Social exclusion, the inadapted people that need to, and this is just kind of a little bit stigmatizing, have to become better adapted. And then the idea of insertion in France, which is this idea again that the individual has to be able to work again based on an implicit norm. The idea of the game changer here for inclusion would be the idea that a society, a company has to be inclusive. The company has to be inclusive and spaces have to be inclusive. In what way is this different? It is different because the question is not the company or the society, and neither the persons or the groups. It's basically eliminating the barriers to inclusion. And that is much more stigmatizing because you're objectifying the obstacles to inclusion. You are not trying to stigmatize the victims. And even though, of course, looking at the obstacles means that the company or society has to pinpoint, of course, and participate in the change. The right to inclusion, in what way is that? In the law? Well, of course, it's in disability law on the international level. There is the International Convention defines for people with disabilities, defines the rights of people with disabilities as human rights, including not only discrimination law and reasonable accommodation, but also economic and social rights. And why is this different? It means that it's a little bit like what we call an economic and social right is a right to, like right to employment, right to healthcare, and right to housing. And the idea would be a right to inclusion. It might allow support from the state if possible. And that's in that way is very different from anti-discrimination law, which just doesn't necessarily include a social and economic right. And so on the individual level, it means that the form of the process requires both equal treatment at work and to acknowledge the differences of people with disabilities in that way, and we're just on the disability model, to eliminate as much as possible the structural barriers to inclusion. Now, for employment, this has only been, and that's why it's not a disability model, it only can happen if it does not impose a disproportionate burden on the employer, which means that there you're looking from disability to disability. You will see that the model that I propose goes beyond this very individual view of reasonable accommodation. But what's interesting in the disability model is that the state can give subsidies to allow the elimination of these barriers. So why is it also interesting in a more general, collective way? It's because when you listen to the new narrative, and I'm saying it can be only a discourse, that can be part of the discussion between us, and that's why I'd like to anticipate that it's not just a discourse, for example, of companies, is this idea of an inclusive company or inclusive society. When you say it in that way, then you're kind of looking at the direct accountability of those institutions and organizations, which means that it's going to also pinpoint a more structural view of looking at anti-discrimination law or equality law. So we have had already litigation on inclusive writing in France that has worked or not worked, but it's looked at universities. And we've had, of course, it poses the question of neutrality in terms of religious discrimination when you have neutral norms which ban philosophical or religious or political signs, because in the recent litigation, you can see that if you ban it completely, of course, it can be seen as an exclusive neutrality, and that the Advocate General in the decision Commune Danse recently has explained this. But it shows that we can think of collective liability for inclusion. So, in what way is all this different from regular discrimination and even gender discrimination law? Well, it's different from direct discrimination. Why? Because inclusion is asymmetric. It means that you don't have to compare with others. You only compare the disadvantages that different groups have, and you try to pinpoint those. You don't try to say, I've been treated differently from others, because it creates competition between the groups. In what way is this different from indirect discrimination? Indirect discrimination is structural. It looks at the disproportionate impact of certain neutral rules, except that indirect discrimination does not pose the idea that you have to change. After you expose indirect discrimination, that's it. There's no positive obligation to change. Is it different from discriminatory harassment? It might be closer inclusion to discriminatory harassment. Why? Because harassment creates a hostile environment. So thinking of inclusion is trying to foster the well-being and promotion of people in the workforce and prevent the risks of inclusion. In that way, it does eliminate barriers to hostility. And then the last one we have is positive action. So positive action or affirmative action in other countries is the idea that you're doing a preferential treatment based on a ground. So we can see it with parity or forms of quota and disability, but also any other difference to help, I don't know, parents, etc. Or we do see it in hiring. Except that, as you know, on the European level, this type of measure has been interpreted restrictively. Why? Because it's an exception to discrimination. The fact that you're preferring one group to another means it's a form of difference of treatment. And so in that way, these exceptions to anti-discrimination law, like any exceptions, must be construed narrowly. So it makes you stuck. You cannot develop positive action because it might create reverse discrimination for other groups. Well, I'm going to suggest maybe inclusion can be formulated or enforced through indirect positive action that circumvents the problem of direct positive action. And I give 6 examples of a way to co-construct. So based on what different groups say of the barriers to inclusion in employment, which can be from recruitment, during the workplace, during employment, and in other circumstances, drawing from their experience to try to see if there's common ground on the types of barriers to inclusions that groups find. And there I see 6. One would be working on work time management. So people care at home. People have problems with job transfers, mobility, availability when you are an older worker or a parent or someone with a disability, or maybe someone LGBTQ plus that might have an issue, or people who have a typical work. All those people might have problems with work time, and you might find common grounds or common solutions to work on those barriers. It can be access to job reassignment and services to promotion. A lot of more disadvantaged groups might have difficulty once they are promoted. How can they obtain career advice? How can they understand when it is important to apply for a promotion? This access to job reassignment services for promotion is a way to help several groups. Codes and Company Cultures 101. We see with artificial intelligence, social networks, dress codes, or online work, that these difficulties can be challenges for different groups. Enlarging to other settings. So in employment, we do see that there are hostile environments above and beyond employment. For example, when you go to work, you can be the subject of racial profiling or sexist comments or hostility against LGBTQ+. You might have problems with housing. It's a way to have a more general view of inclusion. Toxic environment, I won't come to the detail, but there are environments where work communities, by taste, and that's a very economic view of a discrimination, exclude you. It's not that they don't want you, they want to work between themselves. How do we work on this discrimination by taste? And finally, mentoring and coaching, getting the majority, the allies, to help with inclusion would allow to eliminate more barriers. Do we see, and this I will finish this way, do we see basically inclusion, even though Europe talks about it? We have several, we have this term is used in the EU strategy plan of action against racism. We see it used, this idea of inclusion, for example, for the Roma. But the EU strategy on gender equality actually doesn't really talk about inclusion. It talks about diversity. And that's kind of interesting why they do not use this term inclusion. It is often more used also with disability law because it probably comes from the convention. And so, yes, EU equality law and the Commission, for example, is talking more about structural discrimination. We see that, but it's still creating a sectoral approach to issues of anti-discrimination, sex, race, disability, LGBTQ plus issues, and it actually treats differently these issues instead of trying to find the common ground. In France, to finish, we have had a little bit a process which tries to target the barriers to inclusion. It's the law of 2021, accelerating professional and economic equality in all spheres. So it's equality between men and women. Again, it's not all the groups. But for example, it tries to find corrective measures to wage disparities by monitoring them. That is a barrier to inclusion. It tries to look at gender balance in high-level management jobs and committees, not only on the company boards. It tries to work on barriers to inclusion in education so that school counselors have trainings on gender stereotypes, because those are the ones that counsel students to go in math or scientific sectors for women, or that might get younger boys to work in the care industry. It also looks at public investment in startups launched by women. Those are barriers to inclusion in more company spheres. So these can be seen as a form of inclusion, but again, it's only for gender. I won't go into detail, but the plan on racism in France has also been on this question of testing, trying to look at access to public services and housing. That's a more global way to look at inclusion. But as you see, first of all, this bill has stopped. And now in our actual current political atmosphere, all this is as at a standstill, as you probably probably know. So, in what way is this different? And I will conclude this way. In what way are indirect positive action different from regular welfare state rules? Where regular welfare state rules, maternity, retirement, unemployment, sickness, are risks of inclusions that are covered. Well, the difference there is that indirect positive action is drawn from the common experience of groups that face barriers to inclusion in a specific environment. They look at what people who are facing inclusion feel have thwarted their possibilities to work. And you can apply it, of course, to employment, to housing, to public service. So it co-constructs the rules with the people that are the most disadvantaged and are concerned and can explain their perspective to find a coalition in the way we eliminate barriers to inclusion. So to conclude, the idea that I'm suggesting in the book is not to dismantle the current legal frameworks fostering inclusion in anti-discrimination law or equality law or gender law. I'm just saying that the gender model was structural. It has helped us realize that we have to work on the structures, but that if we use the inclusion paradigm on the promoting the equal participation of workers in different organizations, but that have common barriers to inclusion through indirect positive action, we might be able to confront the limits of anti-discrimination law, which it does present other forms of risks like victimization, like only comparing and to prove discrimination, which we see is not easy when there is intersectional discrimination. It can also circumvent, as I said, the narrow scope of regular positive action, which is construed narrowly, and it creates accountability for organizations when you say that a company must be inclusive. There you pinpoint the company directly. So the idea is not only to focus on the justifications to discrimination or the defenses of discrimination that are linked to one perpetrator in one context with one or two or a group of victims, but more to have a more global view of what structural equality and the challenges to structural equality need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mercat-Brun, for this wonderful lecture about gender equality, non-discrimination, and inclusion. I was really, really impressed by this perspective, because when we generally address non-discrimination and gender, we are probably expecting something that was not what we had today, and it's really, really very, very interesting. This, I would call it a normative model of inclusion, opens up many, many interesting perspectives. And I think that is really interesting because of this change of perspective, not looking at groups and grounds, but overcoming also the risk of groupism in all this area. That is something that was raised many times by many scholars. And also the issue, this allows us to overcome the issue of the extension of measures to further groups, and we don't know how many groups and which groups. So inclusion, it's brings about really global perspective that can absolutely bring forward very, very, very interesting concrete perspective, I would say, as well. Before maybe asking you something from my side, I would like to ask the participants if they have comments or questions. Thank you very much. Yes, Federica, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was a really fantastic lecture. Thank you so much for sharing this to us. It's really fascinating. I have one first question regarding this co-construction of norms, which seems super interesting to me because it seems to suggest, if I understood correctly, also like of a bottom-up approach. So something not that the state decides what should be done, but somehow to incorporate also the voices of the people. Which is great, and I'm wondering how in practice should be done,
Okay.
because of course it's quite challenging, but yeah, I think this is also how it should be done, because we should first hear from the people which are their needs before trying to understand which kind of measure can work or not, or first or before first experiment which kind of measures can work or not. And this links maybe to another short of question: how to measure then inclusivity? So how we know that a company state is inclusive enough, or there is some. I mean, this can be a never-ending process, ideally, because of course we are all different, so we can perceive discrimination at also differently on a subjective level. And so I know this is a quite challenging question, but thank you so much. It was really inspiring. Thank you.
So these are wonderful questions. Absolutely. So I'm in the work field. So when I present this book to more, institutes on work, I think we could. There are several ways. First, with new technology, you can have a platform. So this method has been used in a company. I can't cite the company, but through platforms. So social networks where you anonymously explain the barriers you have. So that's a way to draw the narratives. Okay, that's one way through new technology. You have a survey and you get people to say, in different spheres of your employment. And you can explain hiring, you can explain situations, you can give examples of situations, and people can answer the survey directly, coming from different groups, on what are the barriers, why they can't feel they can obtain a promotion, etc. Now, it's true that some of them might internalize the fact that they have barriers. So it might be sometimes possible to suggest possible barriers, and some people might say, yes, I am. I'm finding out that I do have that barrier. So that's a way to draw from. In terms of measures, it would go through collective bargaining agreements. That's a possibility. Because our big problem with collective bargaining agreements is that it's often the majority that decides. So the representations by union workers, especially in terms of gender or certain groups, they're not fully represented. So it would be a way to draw the information, obtain coalitions, because this is the idea, is to say that if you find common barriers, then everybody, the employer and the employees, and you can apply this to different sectors, well, want to have this coalition of solutions, because it applies to different groups. It's in their advantage for it to work. So the representatives, for example, union representatives or other forms of representation, might want to obtain this information, and finding out that there are several barriers for several groups, it's important for them because they want to be able to represent and allow everybody to participate more and more. So if they're only representing some people and they're not even conscious of these problems, I think collective bargaining agreement would be a way. Now, in smaller companies, it might be harder, for example. Why? Because there's no collective bargaining agreement. But being able to use new technology to obtain the information and anonymously, it might be possible. So that's what I would say. Um, the other thing I would say is, for example, we've tried to use it for racial profiling or more general things in public spaces. And there are possibilities. You can use platforms to see how to negotiate the public space, to see how we can avoid hostile environments. When do I feel like there's a racial profiling happening? What are the circumstances? Is it in parks? Is it in transportation? Is it so? So yeah, if this applies, I'm talking about employment, but you could have other ways to obtain the voices of people. Second question is a very good one. I think it's a never-ending process. We always say that positive action is a temporary process so people can be included. I don't believe that. In the book, I talk about the fact, and it really struck me during COVID, that the sanitary crisis, the environmental crisis, the environment, natural environment, the technological crisis, algorithms. So I work on that for the European level too in France because of the new regulation on artificial intelligence. These are constantly changing. So, yes, I think that institutions have to do constant monitoring. If I take employment, a company every year. And that's what we're doing, of course, for equal pay. But this would be, yes, it could. There would be monitoring of inclusion and the dynamics. If you're looking at uh, eliminating the barriers to inclusion, you're looking at a process. Okay, so that process is never ending. It's always changing. Your groups are changing, but the risks are changing. So you are in an environment, for example, when we had COVID, certain people were more disadvantaged than others. Certain groups were more targeted than others. So, of course, it's a relational view of equality, and it's constantly changing. The organization is changing, the groups are changing, the disadvantages are changing, the risks are variable. And especially environment and technology are constantly changing and creating more barriers. So yeah, I think that it's never ending, unfortunately, but I think it's exactly what we see in organizations. If organizations don't move, then they don't work. It's it's about human development and human cohesion. I don't know if I answered your question, Federica.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's really fascinating, actually. Yeah.
Is there someone else that would like to add something? Otherwise, in the meanwhile, just also to follow up also Federica's questions about what do we need to put this in practice
Yes.
also. And I think we explored with Federica's questions and your answers the bottom-up dimension. But I was wondering, what do we need? Do we need anything else? Maybe because this concept of inclusion also reminds of principles, reminds of regulations. I don't know. I'm kind of wondering if
Yes.
also a top-down dimension is included in this perspective, and at which level will be the most promising or the most important for this perspective to become reality?
Okay, that's a wonderful question. Yes, we have to have a legal or regulatory framework maybe to impose these processes. I think that in general, if you don't have that, you have, of course, you still have to convince. What's interesting is inclusion. It's very hard for people to be against inclusion. People can be often against diversity when you come from certain cultures where diversity is not in your culture. For example, France is resistant to diversity because they're not multicultural. So You would have to impose a regulatory process for the inclusion bottom up. So impose it from top down. You could do two things. You have to do the diagnosis. So the idea is, I think and Europe is starting to do it, you have to define structural discrimination. Now they're using the word, they're not taking systemic, they're saying structural discrimination. If you look at the equality strategy, the gender equality strategy from 2020, 2025, you have to define it in the law. I think the directives are going to have to say it might be a combination of direct, indirect discrimination, and maybe positive action. Finding ways to the obstacles to positive action. Then you have to define processes to be able to obtain the bottom up. Okay, you have to safeguard the confidentiality of people because you expose them. If they try to participate in a certain way, it can be seen as a critique, and you don't want retaliation. So you have to protect the people who participate in the process. And if we take the convention for people with disabilities that included the principle of reasonable accommodation, the problem with reasonable accommodation, which is the same thing, the idea that you have to include people and take away the barriers, for example, a door or adjust a workplace setting. The problem with that notion was that it said that you could limit the inclusion through undue burden. And I found out about the cause. So this undue burden allows the institution to say, can't do it, costs too much money, for example. And what's very, very interesting is the first time this concept was used, which can be a defense, the person who wrote the concept in the law, Americans with Disabilities Act, was Heidi Feldblum, that I've met, was at Harvard. And she said that when she put reasonable accommodation, it wasn't a way to create a defense. It was interpreted as a justification for economic costs as a defense. And so maybe what we have to be careful of is when we look at the means to inclusion, that we don't use terms that might be instrumentalized in a way to create defenses to it. We wouldn't have to use the word reasonable accommodation. Reasonable, we would say just trying to target or grasp the common obstacles to employment. And that's first based on the right to participation. So a much more positive way of looking at the obligation, which is common to groups, and not in a more contractual way, in the way reasonable accommodation was viewed in a very individual way. So that's what I'm trying to say, which might be a little bit hard in terms of legal framework to understand, but I do think that the disability model was too contractual. So you could always say, yes, you're asking for this, we do not have the money, so it's not reasonable, this creates an undue burden. If I just say, I'm trying to pinpoint the common problems to groups, not the groups, but the common problems, then you're going to have to find a way structurally to face them because you have all these groups. I'm not saying they're not going to be able to say there might be economic costs. That will be a limitation, but then it's going to be a collective negotiations. And so the leverage will be stronger of the common interests compared to just one individual saying, I need this reasonable accommodation, which is very contractual, and it's much easier to say, I don't want to. If collectively there's a common problem, then it justifies a structural answer. Okay. Of course, if I can't do it, I can't do it. There's going to be at one point a negotiation. But if you're on a coalition, then it's going to be harder to use the defense. So I really am very interested in question. Yes, we need to have it there needs to be a normative framework, but we have to watch out on how we present it. We have to explain the process and see and not integrate possible defenses that try to circumvent what we're trying to do here. I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's really, really fascinating and also much clearer now. Also, the idea of the both dimensions that have to go hand by hand in this perspective. So wonderful, really a wonderful lecture. I can't wait to have your book in my hands and read it really thoroughly. And I remind everybody that this book will be soon translated in English, so it will have even a bigger audience. So I'm very happy to welcome this publication. I guess that we just ran out of time. So I just wanted to thank again our guest lecturer, Professor Marie Mercabrun, for this amazing lecture. I hope that this is just a start of a conversation, of a collaboration. And I thank also everybody for participating in this second event of our gender lecture series. I hope to see you all soon in our next lectures. The full program will be out soon, and we'll be having many lectures until the end of December. So stay tuned, and thank you very much again. Goodbye.
Thank you.